Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger, and this course is CDP 400. And we are going to be using the PowerPoint associated with the book. And the actual PowerPoint is with the Moodle every week as well, so you have the opportunity to see that. All right. So the book starts out with discussing that addiction has been around ever since substances have been around. And there's a division in the field, and you're seeing the new paradigm come in juxtaposition to the old paradigm, in which we have an abstinence only. That's the only way to do it. You have to stop. You can never use again. That type of thing, really based on the 12-step approach. A drug is a drug is a drug. And then we have the harm reduction model, which looks at addiction through a public health lens, and we'll spend a great deal of time looking at harm reduction and where it came from later on in the course. And with harm reduction, the goal is to make use safer, and whether that turns into abstinence or not is the decision of the user. We look at doing things that will decrease the risk for somebody who is engaging in risky behaviors. So one of the reasons why I selected this book for this class is because of the strengths-based perspective and the biopsychosocial aspect of it. And you will see throughout this book that the different theories of addiction are covered, as well as the biopsychosocial aspect. Okay. There's several different theories of addiction. And remember that a theory is not necessarily right or wrong. It's a lens to view different ideas from. So I like to think of it as you're putting on your sunglasses, and maybe your sunglasses are purple, and so you have a purple tint to what you're seeing in the world, or maybe you have the rose-colored sunglasses. So please feel free to agree or disagree with the information that we're going to be presenting in terms of the theories of addiction. It is a very interesting subject, and we could talk about it for hours and hours. Right. So in your Moodle for this week, we have the ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine, definition of addiction, which is several pages long. So you have the paragraph version, and then you have the 4 to 5 page version of it. It's very complex. So some examples of addiction that you might see is maybe the person that has a trach tube, and they're on oxygen and they're smoking, and they're on oxygen because they were smoking, and they could blow up at any minute if the cigarette sparks the oxygen. That's an example that you might be familiar with. This idea of a rock bottom really speaks to motivation, and some people don't believe in the idea that there's a rock bottom. And what that looks like is the rock bottom is, okay, this is my low, I'm going to turn things around. And that can look like things for different people. So one of the things about addiction is that it's not logical. It doesn't make sense to the non-addicted logical brain. And so some of the examples, and this book has a lot of stories in it and case studies you're going to see. If you're unfamiliar with addiction, it might make you scratch your head a little bit, but hopefully through this course we will aim to explain and further deepen your understanding of addiction. Okay. Going back to the examples, arrest, people with addictions becoming arrested, people using while pregnant. And then the last example here, girl hooked on meth, she started using to lose weight. One of the things that we want to look at with addiction is, when do we cross the line from experimentation or use into disordered use? We're not going to be using the word dependence as much anymore, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of this paradigm shift that we are going through. Not only do we have the micro level effects of addiction on an individual and their family, we have the mess on the community, and then the global cost of addiction as well. Drug wars, drug sentencing, incarceration. We have big business involved in addiction, gambling, of course, pharma, big pharma, and alcohol. and now we have the marijuana industry. Okay. So we're going to be looking at this through a biopsychosocial lens, but also a micro, meso, macro lens. Okay. So what is addiction? If we look at the Latin addictus, meaning attached to something, one of the paradigms or theories of addiction that's very popular today, and has been for the past 25 or 30 years or so, is that alcoholism and addiction is a disease. And that is one of the theories that is debatable. Is addiction a disease or not? Is it something that's learned? Is it a moral flaw? One of the older paradigms of addiction was that it was a sign of weakness. And we still see this kind of implanted into the criminal justice system. We're in a transition period where a lot of times addiction is not treated, and it's treated through jail time or prison time, instead of being prevented. We're in the middle, again, of a shift with healthcare integration and looking at co-occurring disorders. But that is one of the arguments. Is addiction a moral weakness? Is it a disease? Do we learn it? Is there a genetic component? Something that's inherited as well? Okay. All right. So prior to 2013, the American Psychological Association had the DSM-4, and it's changed every so often to reflect progressions in society as well as changes in ethics. For example, in the second iteration of the DSM number 2, homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder. And so you can see that we do have to update these things from time to time. And it's largely politically and historically and culturally motivated. Okay. In this week's Moodle module, you have a comparison chart between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. Okay. Prior to 2013, we were using the DSM-4, and it was very dichotomous. You had substance abuse and substance dependence. Now, the issue with that is the word dependence having been used synonymously with addiction. If somebody is insulin dependent, are they addicted to insulin? No, they're not, but they need it to survive. Okay. So just because a person is dependent upon something does not necessarily mean that they are addicted to that. So we went from a dichotomous, you are abusing a substance, to you're dependent on it, to what we're using now, which is a spectrum. And we are no longer using chemical dependency or chemical dependency professionals. We are moving into SUD, substance use disorder spectrum. So a person would no longer be a chemical dependency professional. They'd be a substance use disorder spectrum professional, a setup. So now we have a spectrum. And what was happening previously was that criminal justice, if somebody was arrested for something, that was a clinical criteria. And we know that the criminal justice system is largely prejudiced, and there's systemic racism and bureaucracy involved. And so we know that the majority of drug users are Caucasian. However, the people that are arrested for drug crimes tend to be Hispanic, Black, and of other mixed ancestries and heritages and races. So when they decided about the DSM-5, they took that out of there. Okay. So in order to have substance use disorder, you need to have two of the different criteria that you had here. And now we go from mild, moderate to severe instead of you have a problem or you don't have a problem. Okay. 6 or more of the, if you have 6 or more, it's a severe. And then 4 to 5 would be a moderate problem. Okay. So the criteria of criminality or have you been arrested has been taken off of the official diagnostic criteria, but we have tolerance, which of course is where you start to use and then your body needs more of the substance to get the effect. Withdrawal, using more than intended, Maybe a person decides that they're going to have 1 to 2 beers and they can't stop at 2, and they are into 5 or 6 deep. Reduced involvement in life and obligations, right? Cravings. This is rooted in new science that shows that the brain changes with substances, and that there's a whole science to cravings and what it does in the brain. Okay. Is the person wanting to cut down but has been unsuccessful? Are they unable to stop? Okay, so these two definitely inform each other. Excessive effort to abstain a substance. So sometimes it can become a full-time job. Getting it, using it, recovering from it. Use despite social problems, especially marital problems, relationship problems, friends. Using when physically hazardous. So this could be driving under the influence. Every once in a while there's a report of somebody from an Amish community, usually a teenager, getting arrested for driving a bicycle drunk, or a horse and buggy. That happens every so often. Using at work where you're operating equipment. Okay. And failure to fulfill obligations. All right. So for the purposes of the book that we're using, and looking at it through a strengths-based biopsychosocial perspective, this is the addiction that we're going to be looking at. A pattern of compulsive use, loss of control over a substance or behavior. It has physical, psychological, and social aspects, and the emphasis is on the process rather than the outcome. So we want to look at intention, right? When we're dealing with addictions, we want to look at, when did it become something that you're using to relax with, in terms of it transitioning to be something that you have to have because you can't live your life without it, or other situations like that. So the intention and setting are really important, and we'll talk about that later on. Okay. One of the other changes with the DSM-5 is that gambling is now considered an addictive disorder. The definition of gambling, or the criteria: pattern of preoccupation, lack of control, using it as a form of escape, chasing losses, sense of euphoria when anticipating a win, and deceit to hide destructive behavior. It's very similar to a lot of the behaviors that we see with addiction to substances. And when we think about addiction, we might automatically think about substances instead of behavior. So not only will we be looking at the use of substances, we'll be looking at behaviors such as shopping, gambling, and eating disorders. Okay. So one of the things that you're going to be looking at is addiction a disease? Is alcoholism, is drug addiction a disease? And you will have a couple different films to watch. We'll be watching an argument for that with Dr. Kevin McCauley. And then you'll be watching one from Mr. Lewis about addiction is not a disease. And they both attack it from a science perspective. This is a subject that I would like to talk about during our Voxer conversation this week. Okay. There are certainly pro arguments to it and con arguments to it, and we're going to be exploring it this semester. One of the pros to the addiction is a disease is that it made it a health condition. Addiction is covered under the American with Disabilities Act, and it is also now covered by all insurances. It's a federal law, and it is illegal for insurance companies not to cover mental health and substance use treatment. And that wasn't always that way. So this is true of state insurance, this is true of private pay insurance as well. So by making it a medical condition, it became medically covered. One of the cons of this might be a colloquial attitude of people saying, well, it's a disease, it's never going away, and then using that as an excuse to use. It's not always treated like a disease, though. The addiction field has famously been underserved. There hasn't always traditionally been a lot of education required. So in general, and we'll discuss this, we have chemical dependency professionals and chemical dependency professional trainees that deliver most of the counseling. And now what we're doing with the Healthcare Integration Act is that we have to have co-occurring treatment. So no longer do we well, it's still not all the way integrated, but we're working towards it. But in an integrated setting, and if you're looking for treatment, this is something that you might want to look for. You wouldn't have to go to outpatient to see a mental health counselor and then go to a different building to see across town to see a drug and alcohol counselor. It would be treated together, and the primary point of contact would be your PCP, primary care provider. Okay. And we're seeing more medical professionals now getting addictions training. But unless a person specializes in it, there is not a lot of training actually in medical school. And so now we're seeing a lot of people coming back with their master's degrees and nursing degrees to take the CD classes. Okay. So I would like you to think this week about what's pro for looking at addiction as a disease and the cons about addiction as a disease. Okay. Another resource that you have this week in your Moodle module are the stages of alcoholism by Jelinek. The stages and also the types of alcoholism. He divided them into 5 different categories. Okay. So if we're looking at disease, it's a condition or tendency regarded as abnormal or harmful. Disease is absence of ease. And there's a trifecta here: primary, progressive, chronic, and could potentially be fatal. And so proponents of the disease perspective believe that it fits using these criteria. Okay. Your author of the textbook prefers the word illness instead of disease because it is less controversial and less medical. Okay. One of the main arguments for addiction as a disease is that the addicted brain changes form and shape. Okay. And so the medical community, we can see that. We can see that in scans. Against, some people believe and theorize that it's a habit or behavior, and that the person with the disease needs to take responsibility. And some people believe that people mature out of addiction. In chapter 1 of your book, it's quite interesting. About 10% of people that use drugs and alcohol are truly addicted, and even a smaller percentage of that actually make it to treatment. So for the majority of people that use, people don't become addicted to it. And they can use throughout their life. Your book also states that around age 21, 80% of people could meet the DSM criteria for alcoholism. What happens at 21 in the United States, you can legally drink and buy alcohol. And so we do see phases or bursts of using, and use does not necessarily mean that somebody has a problem with it, and people can go in and out of phases. But there is a percentage of people, about 10% of our population, that really do struggle with addiction to substances or cross addiction or multiple addictions. And there's the argument, well, do some people have an addictive personality, or are they prone to addiction as well? So again, I just want to reiterate that there are a lot of theories about addiction. You don't have to agree or disagree with everything. You can take bits and pieces, of course. Just please look at everything through a critical lens. Okay. So for your social work and psychology majors, our biopsychosocial spiritual model, we're looking at the why, the biology, what's going on at the cellular level, the what's going on in my head, and where is it happening, which is where am I? What's happening socially. Right. The spirituality, we're looking at a connection with something that's higher. And in the 12-step model, they often say higher power to mean God or whatever that looks like to you. And some of the other alternatives to recovery, it's worded different. SAMHSA defines spirituality in a very simple way that can be helpful for people that have difficulty connecting to what does the word spiritual mean? Does it mean religious? And in essence, SAMHSA's definition, if we're looking at the 8 dimensions of wellness for spirituality, is simply a connection to something greater than myself. There's no mention of religion. It's just a connection to something greater than myself. Okay. And dimension 6 of the ASAM, which we'll talk about, how we assess persons for addiction covers spirituality. Okay. Now, one of the questions about addiction is it a chicken or an egg type thing? Am I depressed because I drink, or do I drink because I'm depressed? And where does that cycle start? So it's very much a cycle, and it's not something that's linear. And when we look at the stages of change and motivation, we'll look at where somebody can come in and out of motivation. It's not I did this, and then I do this, and then I do this. It's very much a cycle. Okay. We're going to be spending a great deal of time talking about the family as a system, or as dominoes, and the roles and the interaction, and what recovery looks like as a family. Okay. If you hear thumping or my computer suddenly goes out, my cat probably ran across my screen. So, okay. Getting back to addiction. About 80% of people behind bars, so jails and prisons, and also we could also parlay this into persons in psychiatric institutions as well, have substance abuse problems. Okay. So that's staggering. So the majority of people that are incarcerated in various venues struggle with addiction problems. Okay. In a survey of social workers, 71% of social workers stated that their clients had substance use disorders. Okay. Now, again, we're going to be looking at different types of addiction. You may have heard the term tanorexia. I recommend the show My Strange Addiction. There's a lot of behavioral things on that show, and tanorexia is one of them. And we're going to be looking at internet and screen addiction later on this semester as well. And there is a local treatment center called Restart up in Seattle for adolescent males who struggle with screen addiction. There are a lot of really great movies about addiction. 28 Days with Sandra Bullock, not to be confused with 28 Days Later, which is a horror film. Traffic, Walk the Line, Requiem for a Dream, Spun. There are so many of them out there. Flight with Denzel Washington. And addiction looks like different things. Okay. All right. So the author of your textbook, and largely where the field is going right now, we're moving towards a strengths-based perspective rather than a traditional perspective. And this is where the dichotomy comes into play. So in a traditional approach, you're either a normie or you're a user. There's a lot of labels. If you've ever been to a 12-step meeting, and in this class you will have the opportunity to go to a 12-step meeting. If you go to a 12-step meeting and you introduce yourself, you say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic." Okay, so right there's a label. And in their theory, they believe that it unifies everyone there and brings people to the same playing ground. But there are a lot of people that don't like that, because they think that that's all they are with their identity, or that it's a negative thing to be associated with. Okay, all right. It focuses on losses. Resistance to change can be seen as denial and not rich information. So the way that if a person is not motivated, or they're not ready to give up their substance or become abstinent, it can be seen as, oh, you're in denial, you have to hit your rock bottom. In the strengths-based perspective, we're going to look at that differently. We avoid the labels. We focus on the strengths and use the family as a resource. And so we're great spin doctors. We spin things around a little bit and reframe things into a positive context. So if a person is ambivalent towards change, we're going to explore that instead of jumping and saying, well, you're in denial. You can't change until you want to change. Why are you having difficulty giving up the substance? What would your ideal outcome look like? How is using helping you? How is using hurting you? And so we have more of a dialogue and encourage that dialogue to bloom. Okay, so here's another representation of that. We have our biology here. Either you have it or you don't. Whereas in the strengths space, it's on a continuum. Are you experimenting? Is it being misused? Do you have a mild, moderate, or severe problem? The psychological, it's a one-size-fits-all abstinence-based treatment versus in psycho, we're looking at the strengths, motivation, and then social, we're looking at does it run in the family? Where is the dysfunction? Are you using it to cope with a parent, etc.? Then we're going to use the family as a resource. Okay. So there's multiple ways to go about treating addiction that we'll look at this semester. Okay. In addiction recovery management, it's strengths-based, approved by the UN. Case management can be very helpful in addiction. So usually you have three different parts of treatment. You have the peer support, which is your 12-step meetings, and the focus on that is not counseling. The focus is to find strength, support, and hope from others that have been through the same thing you are, but it's not a substitute for counseling. The second is counseling. Counseling is usually longer term. We get to the root depth of the issues and how we're going to identify patterns and new skills to learn. And then case management is linking the client up to resources and helping them with tools. Okay. The case manager and the counselor are often the same person, but the case manager counselor should never be the sponsor or peer support. There are peer support roles within agencies, and that's handled a little bit differently. Okay. All right. We need community resources for long-term care and interventions that relate to personal needs. So mental care, mental health care, housing, parenting classes, pro bono legal services if necessary. Right? Okay. So think about wraparound services. And we measure success not necessarily in abstinence, but in moderated and modified behaviors. So maybe somebody is drinking 5 drinks every day, and then they are able to go to 4, and then to 3, and then maybe they're drinking every other day. Okay, so measurable goals is very important. Okay. All right. There are 6 critical elements conducive to recovery, and you'll see that the majority of people do not go to treatment. And there is such a thing as a natural recovery, and these 6 elements are involved there, but treatment also provides these 6 elements as well. So the person is not the illness. So we're separating the symptoms from the self-worth of the person. The need for control and choice. So this would be collaborating and giving the client options. Hope that life can get better and can be what you envision it to be. A purpose that could look like a job, that could look like volunteering, that could look like parenting, could look like a lot of things. Achievement, measurable goals, and achieving measurable goals, and the presence of at least one key supportive person. So there are strengths in the divergent modules. There's certainly strengths in harm reduction and certainly strengths in abstinence only based. It's very important that we fit the treatment to the client and not vice versa. There are some resources out there if you want to look at the negative views of the disease model, Stanton Peel, resisting 12-step coercion, and harm reduction in the strengths perspective. We're going to spend some time on that and show you some great resources. Okay. Especially out here in Washington State and Seattle, we're seeing this right now with policy issues of reducing harm, particularly the debate over should we have clean needle injection sites. Previously, the city of Seattle had set aside about $8 million to build 2, and then they decided that there was such an outcry about where would these physical locations be, so they decided to look at mobile units. But it was blocked by the federal government at this time, so they're still intending to do that, and this is something that you can keep up to date on with current events. Project Match, your book talks a lot about this, and they compared different types of treatment to look at their efficacy and efficiency. It was directed by Nia with 2,000 clients over 8 years, which is the largest trial of psychotherapy. So it's quite a large sample size. They looked at 12-step facilitation. So that's a little bit different than 12-step, going to a 12-step meeting where you may or may not be taken through the steps. So there's different types of 12-step meetings. There's process meetings where you go and you talk about your day. There's speaker meetings. There's book meetings. Usually a person would get a sponsor and work through the steps. 12-step facilitation would be a treatment center that walks people through the 12 steps and 12 traditions. Okay. Cognitive, so that's your cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very cost effective, and it works for individuals and in groups. And typical CBT groups are about 12 to 16 weeks long, so a relatively short amount of time for the results that they produce. Okay. And we have motivational enhancement therapy based off of motivational interviewing. It's very cost effective. It's helpful for those with low motivation. It doesn't work for people with high motivation because they're already motivated. 12-step is very good for a religious framework. It is based in Christianity, and it has been adopted by different sects of Christianity and other religions. And then cognitive behavioral therapy is very good with pathology. Okay, right. Oh. The criticism of Project Match was that there wasn't a control group. MET was a shorter intervention, but that also might be because it only needs to be shorter. Okay. And then it just looked at alcoholism and not other substances of choice. Now, what this project did do is it confirmed the effectiveness for diverse treatments, which shows us that we need to have many options for our clients, not just one or two. In Valiant's research, there was a 40-year-long longitudinal study. Those who were in recovery in middle age were found to have had personal willpower, a church group membership, and stable marital relationship and hobbies. So look how well-rounded this is. Okay, so we have those 6 criteria here, don't we? All right. Okay. Some more research for you. In California, they looked at $1 spent on treatment saves $7 across the state. Okay, so we know that we do need states and our governments to invest in treatment. Okay. Brief interventions are very helpful, motivational interviewing. Also, if we look at addiction through a holistic lens and we're able to pair different treatments, certainly if a person exercises, they're probably going to have some results. But if they pair diet and exercise, they're going to have greater results. And so we want to look at that as well. So we have motivational interviewing, naltrexone, MAT, which is medical-assisted medication or medically assisted treatment, and then cognitive therapy. So if we can use more than one thing and hit addiction through the biopsychosocial lens, not just one, but all 3, then we can have great success. All right. So some of the things that we're seeing right now is that we have more prescription drug misuse, and there's some interesting policy occurring around that right now. In December 2017 or 2018, one of the first big pharma billionaires was actually arrested and charged, and his trial was this past spring 2019 for bribing doctors to prescribe medications, specifically opiates. So there's some interesting policy happening around that, including prosecuting doctors who overprescribe. Okay. We're seeing harm reduction being increasingly recognized in the United States, looking at it through a public health approach. And this really came from the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. And that's one of the models that we use harm reduction with. More and more places are looking at non-abstinence-based treatment programs, including using medical marijuana instead of opiate treatment, and using more MATs. We're seeing more and more that harsh drug laws are causing harm, and in several states where marijuana is legal recreationally, the governors of those states have given pardons to people that had marijuana sentences and letting a lot of people out of prison. Most Americans do favor treatment over jail. We're looking at how can we keep people out of jail and keep them connected to their communities and give them support. And also for those that are leaving jails and prisons, how can we help them with reentry? We see drug courts and mental health courts, really fantastic programs that bridge that gap between the punitive side and the therapeutic side and the social side as well. We are looking more at co-occurring disorders and how they inform each other, mental health and substance use. And we're looking at reducing craving through medication, so there's your MATs. And then restorative justice, how do we work with victims and defenders to promote healing? All right, so this is your introduction to treatment. I hope that you find this class stimulating and exciting, and please pose any questions that you have for me to our Voxer discussion this week.